Ian Bannerman from Taylor and Francis. I wondered if Tony could just expand a little bit on that last point, because it was quite intriguing. I didn't quite get it where you were at with database journals, but also to the other two panelists, what do they think a database journal might look like and how data could become more integrated into journals?
Yes, I apologize. I did cram a lot in there. I'm sorry. I guess, at least the way it seems to me, is there's one group of people looking at how we get the data under control, with the focus being primarily at this stage about databasing it. Just getting it archived, getting it standardized, getting it made safe, getting it discoverable, I hope. But in parallel, you've got the journals dealing with what they see as their core business, which is the publications. Yes, they know there's supplementary data, and they know that'd be nice to handle that better. But why should these things go in parallel? The research databases is one thing, the journal publishing is the other. Maybe there's a business model which is actually bringing those two into one, where some versions of it would be more about the data, some would be more about the publication itself. But that way you could then look beyond the individual chunks of data and publications and concentrate on the layer above that. What value can be achieved by connecting data across studies or connecting knowledge across studies? I think that's where the real future is. Otherwise, we'll just have a very big digital library out there. It's as I was given one very simple example of. To know the frequency of a mutation in a set of diagnostic lab data, right, is a piece of data. To know the frequency in the general population is another piece of data. It's when you compare the two, you can make conclusions. Right? Let's have a system that's designed to make those connections straight away. I mean, that's an incredibly simple example. But I hope that gives you a sense of how I see it.
Okay. Do you have anything to say to that? Or? Yeah. No. There was a second part to your question, wasn't there? But you were asking the other presenters.
No. A general open question of how they see the intersection between data and
yeah, I think that's for you too. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a growing view that there is more that can be shared through the scholarly communications process than the summary, than the methods, that there is a research interest in having a richer object of communication. And so that would be, yes, the findings, the knowledge which has been generated. But if we're talking about genuinely rigorous research, then we need to be able to drill down beneath that and address the sort of things that Kerstin raised about the data quality. What are the uncertainties here? How was the data created? So you need to get into, we know this, you need to get into the methods, you need to be able to look at the data itself, you need to understand how it was generated, you need to look at the algorithms or whatever processes was made to extract the data that's presented from a larger fundamental data set. And being able to share and communicate that with one's peers is an important part of the research process. And so that seems to indicate to me a more complex object of research communication, which allows all these things to be pulled together. Now, I mean, one could regard that as, okay, well, that's just the web, whereby you can follow the links and pull it all together. Or there may be examples in which it can all be pulled together into a research object.
Do you have anything to say, Kerstin? Or?
Yeah, no, I was just actually had a question to Tony in some way. My concern was we've had experiences with systems that basically just allowed discovery, and that you're keeping sort of the discovery level metadata and leave it up to the individual investigator or the institution and whatever to take care of the data. And just a lot of that data has disappeared because it wasn't really curated. It was sitting on people's website, in a non-curated database. And so there is a problem of the longevity and the reproducibility in the end, because there is no control over what happens to the data. If there's a formal publication process where you make sure that's the data set that is cited and it stays that way. So I just posing that question.
It's a very good question. So the long-term safety, security, availability of the data is critical. I agree. But for data discovery, it shouldn't matter whether that's kept in the individual sources or aggregated into a repository. Of course, moving it into a repository makes it simpler to fund and ensure that it's long-term available. So I fully support the idea of, whenever possible, moving it into a repository. Let's assume, whether it's local or put into a repository, it is now safe and they're long-term. And if it's the kind of data which you can then share openly, you should. I was saying, but often it will be, for various reasons, data that you cannot let people have open access to, and managed access is too clunky. Well, it at least let them discover that the data exist in your repository or your local system. And it doesn't have to be that you only allow that discovery to happen by searching the metadata. This is key. You can also allow them to search the data. Any patients of this age, this gender, this phenotype, mutation in that gene and that gene, you can ask questions of the data and be told, yes, we have such a patient, without actually then handing on the full description of that patient. Yes, no, you could argue that if you start asking sufficiently detailed questions, you've gathered the data because you know there is a... But it doesn't give, and you'd have to think about where you risk patient identification there. For example, small number cases and so on. But the principle is you don't have to only allow the discovery to happen via the metadata. You can go into the data as well. Can I just comment on one more thing? Because let's imagine we do all of this, we have discovery and data and everything connected and all, it's a wonderful world. Can we then use that to make new knowledge? This is the idea of knowledge engineering. I think we have to be realistic about how doable that will be. In the mid-80s, someone came up with the term knowledge engineering, and then there was a whole group of people, a whole lot of effort went into, let's bring bits of data together, individual discoveries, because just like a set of jigsaw pieces, surely they fit together to describe reality, right? And we can understand reality by putting all the different observations together. At the end of 10, 20 years of effort, most of the people had given up on that because they realized these weren't jigsaw pieces at all. They were more like Lego bricks. They don't only go together one way. They can be put together lots of different ways. And the reason they were more like Lego bricks rather than jigsaw pieces is that they weren't sufficiently well described. And that's back to your point exactly. It didn't tell you how was the experiment done, what was the quality, what was the population background, whatever. All those important little details that you need to properly know how to use those data. Otherwise it becomes a general, it looks a bit like a jigsaw piece, but it's got very rough edges. You can put it together many different ways. And so people found by trying to do knowledge engineering without the sufficient detail in the data, that they came up with all sorts of different pictures of reality, which is not what we want to just go on and do again on a bigger scale with modern technologies. So it's critical. I'm just giving a reason why I support you very much in your argument that all the metadata, all the provenance, all the other stuff has to be there. Otherwise, we have to let researchers just go and phone each other and discuss it one-to-one to get down to those levels of detail.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Thanks. Alice Meadows from Wiley, and thank you. Really, really interesting talk. I think, Tony, you might have sort of answered this already, but you may want to add something. But I wondered whether the panel has a sort of a take-home message for us as publishers and societies about, one thing you'd like us to do, one recommendation, one piece of advice. What would you like us to take home from your perspective as far as data is concerned?
Well, from my point of view, and I mentioned this editors' roundtable. It was publishers at the table as well as the editors there. Is to agree at least on the basic requirement that data that is basically discussed in an article, presented in graphs and so on, is available, and that is still, from my domain, it's not the case, still not. And we have guidelines that were developed by the publishers and the editors, but the editors feel it too much of a burden to put on reviewers, to ask them and do those checks. That's why we have said, we as the data repository can help with that process and so on. But if there would be an agreement across all the publishers to actually stay at least ask for compliance with that basic rule that the data is disclosed. And if there are community acknowledged data centers out there, that it goes into those centers and is linked, I think that would be a major step already. So, and getting, I mean, in many ways, this is really exciting here because these are obviously publishers very closely related to learned societies. There is, when we were running this editors roundtable 2 weeks ago, and there was a clear statement made that we need more involvement of the societies because they represent the voice of that particular community, and they can help to endorse standards that the publishers can then implement. So that would be my goal or the hope.
I'd make a more general comment to the world of publishing. I think in the past, I'm still clearly getting up to speed with this, so it may be nonsense, but it seems to me that in the past, publishing of journals, at least, was done the same way in all places for all disciplines, right? You knew what to do. You got papers come in, you reviewed them, you published them, and you charged people for the books. Then it started to change, and if we look at where it's going to be in the future, it's not going to be one way of doing a business, one business model. There'll be 1,001 different aspects to publishing. It'll be a much more complicated, diverse, and interesting universe. Some dealing with data sharing, some dealing with archiving, some dealing with IDs. Who knows? All these different aspects that are going to be needed to really let the total universe of publishing do everything it can do. And I would say that a publisher today should try to get their head around that to the extent that they can make a decision. Which corner of that market, which aspect of that future do they want to be an expert in? Because at the moment, it seems like you're all trying to just spread and grow your business to do a bit of everything without really working up, we can't do it all. Which bit do we want to do best? There will always be a role for traditional type publishing. Maybe you just stick to that and become someone who has the best quality content, not lots of content. Other groups might want to have lots of content so that they can make more digital connections. I don't know. There's lots of different aspects to all of this. And probably your companies and your staff and your skills can't do some of the things you want to do. So if you're going to reinvent your company, you need to hire new people or partner with different companies from completely different areas. So it's really just breaking the mold, breaking out of traditional ways of thinking and being brave. I think that's how you create the future.
For my comment, I really want to go back, I think, to it's fairly similar to what Kerstin said, but it's sort of slightly more from a sociological sort of history of science point of view. Tony mentioned Tony mentioned the Human Genome Project and the more recent initiative around. I think there's an interesting history of scientific collaboration around data to be written about these various projects, like the Human Genome Project and the Bermuda and Fort Lauderdale agreements, which established data sharing there, and various other research areas where data sharing has been very successful. In crystallography, for example, because they were able to establish at the beginning of the 1990s the CIF format, which really is the basic format for sharing crystal data structures. And the community coalesced around that and decided, yes, that's how we're going to do it. And in large part, that was through the International Union of Crystallography and the role of their journals, which brings me on to the key point, which is that journal editorial boards, the community around a journal, learned societies are the closest thing that you can get to a representative body for researchers and for a research field. And therefore, you have an important role. Those groups have a very important role in establishing a data policy and a data practice which is representative of the requirements of a given research area and, indeed, the will of that group of researchers. There isn't necessarily one size fits all. Different research areas have different requirements. And beyond the general principle that it is a good thing to make data available for reuse, there's lots of edge cases. Arguably there's so many edge cases, there's no middle. There's such a lot of diversity. And it's only through real engagement with representatives of the researcher community, these things can be established. But they need to be established. I think there really is an urgent need for them to be established because there's a big opportunity in research terms that is being missed through the lack of data availability and data sharing. So engagement with those sort of processes would be the take-home.
Okay. Thank you all. Actually, I think that was I think a really good place to stop, actually. I mean, we're a few minutes ahead, but it just feels like, we're not going to top that. So can I just thank the three speakers again. Thank you all for coming.